Mello is a character I'm only beginning to love more and more as time goes on, with Mello having surpassed Nier and L on my favorite characters list. With the sudden increase in my liking of Mello, it's quite clear that I've been thinking more about him. While it is true that Mello is one of my most analyzed characters, all my previous analyses on Mello have been very heavily based off of Death Note and Another Note, which is a novel with Mello as a narrator, so it was inevitable that I would gain plenty of ideas on Mello from that. Generally, the main core of all my analyses is as such. Throughout the series, Mello has his internal struggle of what motivates him to catch Kita. Is it to avenge L, or is it because of his ego and his lust to surpass Nier? Both of these sides of Mello are constantly at a struggle, but it's a lot of them mostly takes precedence throughout the series. In the end, however, when Hall told Mello that Nier has a plan, Mello feels so cornered and without choice that, while he still feels jealous of Nier, he has avenging L take priority, motivating him to sacrifice his life in order to defeat Kita and hand Nier the victory. My main evidence for these claims lie within Another Note's implication that Mello did indeed plan on dying. Mello constantly obsessing over L, and Nier's line in the manga that him and Mello are motivated by the desire to avenge L. All of these are working in tandem with one another. However, what I want to do for this video is something a bit different. I want to branch off from this series of Mello analyses and make a new one, this time ignoring Death Note and Another Note completely and focusing exclusively on the manga. Why am I doing this? Despite the fact that I tried clearing up most of the inconsistencies regarding Mello's character in the novel, I would absolutely understand why someone would interpret the novel as entirely non-canon. After all, even if the inconsistencies are made sense of, it would still be vastly annoying for someone's interpretation of a character in a series to be completely altered and ruined by some other work that's separate from the actual main series. I want to account for both readings of whether or not Another Note is canon and look at Mello for the sake of fairness, and also simply out of curiosity of what Mello's character arc is when viewed simply from Another Note. First and foremost, I want to get this very crucial part out of the way. Ignoring Another Note, do I think Mello planned on dying? I've explained in another video why it wouldn't not make sense for Mello to plan on dying, with me disproving points to try to disprove the theory, but my main evidence for it was still Another Note. So that said, did he plan on dying or not? Well, one argument for it could be that Mello decided to take his helmet off, except that doesn't really prove anything because his helmet only covered his face to the extent that a Death Note user would still know what he looks like. Judging from how Takeda says she now knows his face when she first saw through the helmet, and there'd be no significance whatsoever in this thought being shown if it wasn't enough for her to kill him. I do think both Takeda and Mello would have known the limitations of the Death Note involving how much of the victim's face the user needs to see. For Takeda, I think Light would have told her during one of their meetings, while Mello could have learned of these limitations when he was experimenting with the Death Note. Now with that said, it could be either, but I think the conclusion of this analysis should answer the question. However, it's worth bearing in mind that another thing I garner from Another Note is Mello's struggle between wanting to avenge L and wanting to surpass Nier, but I don't think this conflict is present if we're only looking at the manga. His jealousy is prevalent throughout. Now I want to address Nier saying that him and Mello are motivated by the desire to avenge L. What does that mean for Mello's character? Well, first off, let's consider the possibility that he was lying about Mello. He does have very legitimate reasons to lie about Mello's motives, as this successfully led to Aizawa cooperating with Nier, with Mello being the only factor holding Aizawa back at that point. However, what suggests this may indeed be the truth is how Hal chimes in, clarifying that Mello wants to catch Kita before Nier does, which is the truth. The reason I think this suggests Nier isn't lying is the fact that, judging from how it didn't discourage Aizawa, her use of the words "to be clear," and the fact that Nier is never troubled by this, her statement was not really supposed to be a contradiction of what Nier said as much as it was a mere addendum. So, how does this work? Well, let's look at what Nier said. He said that L was the only person he and Mello respected, and Kita murdering him motivated them to catch him. However, this doesn't necessarily mean Mello wanted to avenge L, while this may be the case for Nier. The thing is, Mello respected L in the sense that he saw L as some sort of goal he has to reach in order to actually beat Nier in all these competitions from whammies. This is evident from when Mello felt a surge of rage at hearing about L's death. The moment he heard this news, the first thing he was concerned about was that L would be unable to choose who becomes the next L. In other words, it's at this very moment when Mello feels like he can never achieve his goal of surpassing Nier, there's no more hope. Mello will constantly stay below Nier forever, except it can't be, Mello thinks. There must be something that can be done. His focus shifts from becoming number one in whammies and hoping L selects him to actually stopping Kita as a final way to prove he's better than Nier. Solve the case that even L failed to solve. This is when any respect he's had for L was completely lost, L being someone who lost to Kita. This explains why he leaves whammies as a symbolic way of showing he's going to surpass Nier in a different way. Fast forward to when Mello successfully takes a Death Note from the task force. I think that here Mello feels a surge of optimism, with him feeling like he could finally surpass Nier and become number one. Now I think that Mello respects and likes Soichiro because Soichiro, being a key part in his plan to get the Death Note, represents and reminds Mello of his momentary victory over Nier. I mean, we know that Mello does horrendous things such as murdering the SBK agents, but they're all to achieve specific goals, yet Mello said he didn't want Soichi to die when Soichi was actively threatening his life and being nothing more than an obstacle. Now after Light regains the notebook, Mello's obviously the one losing the most in this game. He lost all of his subordinates, he lost the death note, his name is discovered, and his spy within the SPK is lost, so he has to rely on Hall to pass along information to him. What follows next is a confrontation between Nier and Mello. This is a very interesting scene, but since in my next video I'll be doing a line by line analysis of that specific scene, I'll refrain from talking much about it. However, one key part to take away from this is how Mello exploded when he learned he helped Nier, but then the scene ends on Mello giving Nier information and aiding him intentionally because he didn't feel good about Nier helping Mello with nothing in return. One of the reasons behind this is very closely tied to a common theme related to Mello's character, and that is him always wanting to compensate for his failures by doing the act that made him feel like he failed, this time intentionally, so that the previous act wasn't a failure, somewhat similar to Light's mindset. Like for example, Mello just gave Nier the position of L before storming out of whammies. You see this in this scene too. Mello felt angry at the fact that he aided Nier, so he decided to aid Nier by passing along information to not only flaunt his superior knowledge, but also to make it seem as if he decided to help Nier. This way, Mello can still feel like the dominant one during a situation. We see this mentality affecting him a bit later as well. For example, when Mello sent Mogi over to Nier so Nier could interrogate Mogi, and both Mello and Nier can get information, I think that's Mello saying Nier is going to learn information on the Kita case, but that's fine because I was the one who caused it. The reason he wants to beat Nier in the first place is because his ego was challenged, so if he aids Nier from time to time intentionally, he would still feel like the superior one here. However, that isn't to say he'd aid Nier and then allow Nier to take the victory so he can feel like Nier wouldn't win without him. After all, Mello still wants to prove himself to be better than L as well, not to mention Mello subconsciously still wants to prove to himself that he's capable of solving the case on his own. Another thing I find interesting about Mello handing Mogi over to Nier is that Mello, the envious Mello who refuses to believe anything good about Nier, outright complimented Nier by directly acknowledging his skills, and when he can hear Mello at that. Over here, I think that Mello is attempting to minimize how much Nier threatens his ego, this time by using Nier's skills and abilities to Mello's own benefit. Now by the time Nier's dominating the game, he's learned everything about Kita, has forced Kita into a corner, and has been giving information to Mello so that Nier could use Mello. I think Mello began going deeper and deeper into his denial of his. As an example of this, just shortly after Nier gave Mello all the info through Hall, Mello recruits Matt, who I think is someone Mello is friends with because Matt doesn't really threaten Mello's ego, so his very presence makes Mello feel better because he's reminded that he's more intelligent than the third smartest whammy child. Another sign of this is how Mello adorably thinks that Nier gave Mello all the SPK's information as a thank you for sending Mogi over to the SPK. The possibility of Nier wanting to use Mello has already been presented to him, so he decides to believe that Nier is giving all this information not so that Nier could use him, but rather for a reason that Mello has a direct involvement in, so Mello could feel like he himself is responsible for this sudden advantage. He doesn't want to acknowledge Nier as the one who is controlling the situation. Now we reach the end. Hall tells Mello of Nier's plan to have his name written in the notebook, and Mello sadly exclaims how he has to do it. If he does plan on dying, then he's distraught over his upcoming death, but if not, then he's distraught over Nier being so close to victory that the most he can do is enact a plan which serves as an extremely risky last resort. Now, if we take into account what we just looked at, Mello wanted to help Nier so he can feel superior, I do think that even when only looking at the manga canon, Mello did indeed intend to die. Not because he took his jealousy aside, but rather because I think here, Mello realizes that either Nier will win, which is bad, or Nier will die, which is bad too, because as Hall pointed out earlier, Mello wouldn't want Nier to die because then his victory over Nier is meaningless. So he finds out the flaws in Nier's plan and decides to give his life in order to let them be known and save Nier, if his assumptions on Kita's plans are true. He realizes he won't be able to solve the Kita case and surpass Nier and L. The most he can do is at least have Nier realize just how pivotal Mello was, and that without Mello, Nier wouldn't really be much. Also, I think he decides to take the option of death, presumably because his life's goal is centered around beating Nier. Anyways, this was extremely fun to make, and I really love talking about Mello. Hope you enjoyed and subscribe for more content.